The rain falls as if the sky were crying in advance. There is no music, no screams, no hope. Only the repeated sound of raindrops striking the broken ground of a city that no longer exists. In the midst of that wet silence, a figure walks slowly, dragging a wounded leg, breathing with difficulty, but never stopping. The wind stirs his dark, soaked hair, and for an instant, his shadow looks like his father's, though he is no longer there. In front of him, two blue lights stare, cold, impassive, with the arrogance of gods who cannot feel. The androids, the killers of everything that once made sense. But Gohan doesn't tremble. There is no fear in his eyes, only a sad calm, a peace that no longer belongs to the living. He closes his eyes for a second, as if remembering something. A face, a laugh, a broken promise. And then he smiles. It's a small smile, almost imperceptible, but real. A human smile in a dehumanized world. Because he knows he's not going to win. He knows he won't get out of there. But he also knows that if he dies here, someone else will live. And that someone has a name. Trunks. In that moment, the rain blends with the tears of destiny. And when thunder roars across the sky, he charges. There is no strategy, no miracles, only will. Blow after blow, a choreography of desperation and love. His body, worn and broken, moves like a memory refusing to fade. And every impact, every fall, is a wordless phrase. Don't give up. Not yet. But before reaching this point, before becoming the warrior who faces the end of the world alone, there was a child who once dreamed of learning to fly, who laughed while chasing butterflies, who grew up listening to stories about heroes who saved the earth. That child's name was Gohan, and his destiny was, ironically, to save it too. But destiny sometimes has a cruel sense of humor. Let's go back then, to that other time, that world still breathing, where colors were warm and days had sunlight, where his father, Goku, was still alive. Gohan was then just a bright, shy, sensitive boy. In his heart there was kindness, infinite curiosity, and a light his mother hoped to keep far from war. But the universe rarely grants peace to the children of heroes. When Goku died from the heart virus, the world became a little grayer. There was no epic battle, no glorious sacrifice, just a disease, silent, human, so simple, so cruel. Gohan, too young to fully understand, watched as his greatest figure, his example, faded before his eyes. In that moment, something broke, something invisible, something that wouldn't make noise until years later, because heroes aren't supposed to die like that, right? Not in a bed, not without a fight. But destiny doesn't ask, it simply takes. And then they came, the androids, perfect, indifferent, beautiful in their coldness. They killed everyone, Vegeta, Piccolo, Krillin, Yamcha, Teen. Every name Gohan once spoke with hope became an echo. The world turned into a cemetery of memories. And in the middle of that void, the boy had to grow up. Not because he wanted to, but because there was no other choice. Seeing all that didn't just make him a warrior, it made him a guardian. He found Trunks among rubble and fear. In that child, he found a reason to keep going. Training together wasn't just about building muscle, it was about practicing the patience of hope. Gohan taught Trunks how to strike and fall, how to breathe when anger wanted to become a storm. He taught him not to confuse fury with justice, not to use strength as a substitute for lost love. And in those sessions beneath skies that were no longer blue, the master and the student exchanged more than tactics. They shared guilt. They taught comfort. What does a man do when responsibility overwhelms him? He becomes a mentor, because the act of teaching is also the act of trusting the future.
He faced the androids with that mix of despair and purity that defines him, not out of vengeance, but out of duty, not with fearless courage, but with a habit forged in loss. On the lines dividing city and nothingness, He fought with everything he had and everything he'd been taught. His battles weren't duels of ego. They were duels of endurance, fought to win one more second, one more breath for those still able to flee. There were fights where his ki burned with brutal honesty, where his voice mixed with metal and sparks, where every technique was not a display, but a prayer. And when the wound came, when flesh tore, when pain reminded him he was mortal, he kept fighting. That is one of the truths his story gives us. The purest kind of bravery is not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep existing despite it. Sometimes, when the silence was too long, Gohan wondered if his father had felt the same when it all began. If the fear he felt was the same Goku once felt before becoming a legend. But there was no one left to answer. Only ruins, wind, and the echo of mechanical laughter in the distance. Over time, Gohan stopped being a child. His gaze grew harder, his body stronger, but his soul aged too soon. He was the last Saiyan of his era, the only one left standing. And in a world where hope was a luxury, he decided to take on the role no one else could, to be another's teacher. He found Trunks, a boy with the same mix of innocence and rage he once had. He trained him among the ruins under sunless skies, teaching him how to fight, but also how not to hate. Because he understood that hatred was easy, and the hard part was keeping your heart clean when everything you loved had been destroyed. Sometimes, when Trunks would collapse in exhaustion, Gohan would watch him silently, and for an instant it seemed he saw his father in him. Not Goku the warrior, but the man, the father. And here we must pause, because that relationship, that bond, is the soul of his story. Gohan didn't train Trunks to create a soldier, but to preserve something already fading: humanity itself. We all carry the weight of our losses, the ghosts that walk beside us. But what sets a hero apart is not the absence of pain. It's what he chooses to do with it. And Gohan chose to turn his pain into teaching, his fear into a shield, his sadness into fire. Time, however, does not forgive. In one of those battles, Gohan lost an arm, torn off by the same enemies who had destroyed his childhood. But not even that stopped him. With only one arm, he kept training, kept fighting. He kept smiling in front of Trunks, as if the wound didn't hurt. But it did. It hurt more than he could ever admit. Because more than his body, it was hope that bled. There comes a point in every story when the hero understands there will be no happy ending, that what awaits him is not victory, but surrender. And that moment came for Gohan on a gray afternoon when the sky was preparing to rain. Trunks wanted to go with him into battle, but Gohan knew he shouldn't. Because if Trunks died, the future would die with him. So with a trembling voice inside, but steady on the outside, he made him unconscious. He hit him. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. The kind of love that hurts, that disguises itself as hardness to protect what it loves. That is one of the most beautiful and saddest contradictions of being human: to hurt in order to save, to lie in order to protect, to leave so the other can stay. All of us, at some point, have been Gohan. We've had to close a door knowing the other wouldn't understand why. We've had to be the villains in a story that deep down was about love. And so we return to the beginning, to the rain, to the sound of his footsteps on the shattered asphalt, to that final fight that wasn't a battle, but a farewell. Every strike he threw was a memory, a prayer, a goodbye. In every movement there was a promise,
that Trunks would live, that the future somehow would keep breathing.
They say that when a hero dies, the world changes a little. But what Gohan teaches us is that sometimes the world doesn't change at all. It's us who change by watching him die. Because his story isn't about strength or power or victory. It's about the courage to keep walking when there's nothing left. It's about staring into the void and deciding that, even when all is lost, one can still be human. And as lightning illuminated the ruins, Gohan fell. There were no speeches, no triumphant music, only the rain. Witness to a sacrifice no one would see, no one would tell. Except one. A child who would wake up in tears and find his master's body, motionless in the middle of the silence. That child would scream, and in that scream, something new would be born. Not vengeance, but awakening. A golden spark would ignite the air, the first light of the future. Because the legacy of a hero is not measured by the victories he achieves, but by the souls he awakens. Sometimes people confuse heroism with power. They believe being strong is about flying higher or defeating more enemies, but Gohan teaches us that true power lies in enduring without losing kindness, and standing up when there are no reasons left, only memories, and continuing to fight even when the ending is already written. That is the kind of strength that cannot be trained, the one that rises from the wreckage of the soul. And if we think about it, we all have a Gohan in our lives. Someone who fought for us without us noticing. Someone who protected us from the world, who carried silence, who fell so we could rise. It could be a father, a mother, a brother, a friend, even someone who's no longer here. We all carry the echo of those invisible sacrifices. And sometimes without realizing it, we become that echo for someone else. Because in the end, the cycle repeats. What Goku was for Gohan, Gohan was for Trunks. And so the story doesn't stop, it only changes form. What dies is not the hero, but the version of the world he tried to save. And in that death, something else is born. Inspiration. There's something deeply human in that idea. We spend our lives trying to leave a mark, fearing oblivion, fighting for a place in someone's memory. But Gohan sought none of that. His life was brief, broken, full of losses, and yet it was enough to change a universe. Because sometimes one single act, one single sacrifice is enough to redraw the destiny of everything that follows. On the darkest nights, when Trunks looked at the stars, he often wondered if Gohan could see him, if he knew what he had done with his teachings, if he was proud. And though there was never an answer, the wind always blew a little stronger, as if the entire universe was returning a caress. Perhaps somewhere beyond time, Gohan did see him. Perhaps he watched with the same calm smile he had under the rain that last day. Perhaps he understood that, although his body was left behind, his story didn't end there. Because legends don't die. They dissolve into the world's memory and are reborn every time someone decides not to give up. And his story isn't just that of a warrior. It's the story of anyone who has ever felt like they were fighting alone. Of all those who have carried invisible weights, who rise without applause, who love without being understood. Gohan represents that kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to be seen to be real. The kind that saves us without knowing it. The future he left behind was gray, yes, but within that grayness, a spark still shone. And that spark was enough. Because it's not about changing the whole world, but about keeping a small part of it alive. An idea, a kindness, a hope. That's what Gohan was. The last spark. The reminder that even when all is lost, there's still something worth protecting.
And if you listen closely, if you close your eyes, you can still hear him. Not in words, but in the feeling of moving forward when no one else is left. In that human stubbornness that drives us to endure. In that voice that speaks to us from somewhere among the ruins of time. It doesn't matter how many times you fall. What matters is what you protect while falling. Because in the end, future Gohan wasn't just the last legend of tomorrow. He was the proof that even at the end of the world, the human heart can keep beating. And maybe in the end, that's what hurts the most and what inspires the most about future Gohan. That no one heard his last cry, that his sacrifice had no audience, no hymns, and yet he gave everything, not for glory, but for love. In a world that had forgotten what it meant to care for another, he chose to keep believing. Because sometimes the hero is not the one who wins, but the one who endures. Gohan reminds us that even when everything seems lost, when days are filled with ruins and hope is barely a whisper, there's always a reason to keep standing. Maybe we don't save worlds, but each of us fights our own invisible battles against fear, against loneliness, against exhaustion. And in those silent fights, his story reaches us, teaching that even with one hand, even with a heart full of cracks, there's still something worth protecting. There's still room to love. Because legends aren't always born in the skies or written in fire. Sometimes they're born in an exhausted body that decides not to give up. In someone who, despite everything, keeps believing that the future, no matter how dark, is still worth it. If you felt something while hearing his story, if you believe there's still space to remember those who fought in silence, I invite you to stay, to keep exploring with me those lives that teach us that even in broken worlds, something beautiful can still bloom. Subscribe, share, leave your mark here, because as long as there are those who remember, legends, like future Gohan, never truly die.